morning. Well, thanks very much for joining today. My name is Lachlan Cash. So the session this morning is Microsoft Dynamics for Finance and Operations Warehouse Management Deep Dive. So just as a little bit of a show of hands, who's new to warehouse management in D365 Finance and Ops? Okay, maybe a little bit more than 50%. Who thinks they're an expert? I put my hand down. So it's a really good question. It's a big module in terms of the amount of functionality, the configuration, and stuff like that. I guess what I wanted to try to do in this session is go through some of the process flows, some of the configuration pieces, also touch on some of the what's new in terms of what's coming. There's a couple of preview features in some of the current builds, but there's a lot more to come. And so I guess that's what I wanted to try to get across in this session. So I sort of realized that we sort of got a little bit of a mix of kind of new and folks that have been around for a while. So I'll try to keep that balance in there as much as we can. So maybe just as a little bit of a recap. So what we're talking about is warehouse management in the context of inbound logistics, quality management, some new features coming there, and outbound logistics. So getting the materials in, getting the materials out, or moving it around within the warehouse. Also moving it around within the context of production. If we need to do raw materials to a work cell or a work location, we can use the warehouse management to do that. So that's essentially what we're talking about. So what does the warehouse management functionality, where does it actually apply? So what we wanted to talk about here is what are we trying to do with the warehouse management? What are the features? And what sort of customers can you sort of target with it? So essentially, we're talking about an integrated warehouse management. So it's deployed within the finance and operations. It doesn't stand alone to that inventory management functionality that we have out of the box. There's certainly other third-party warehouse management solutions that integrate to finance and operations, and customers have warehouse management, but we're not trying to play in that role of a standalone warehouse management solution. As well, we're not targeting the warehouse management as a 3PL, meaning that an operator of a third-party logistics, they could certainly use the functionality within it, but there's certainly features like billing and stuff like that we don't have within the product, so that's what we're not positioning to a third-party logistics company. There's certainly ISVs that add some of that sort of functionality to the product as well. So that's kind of where we're sort of targeting the product. So we're focused in these broad industries: retail, distribution, manufacturing. Essentially any customer that needs to move some sort of inventory. If it's got a number, if I can put a barcode on it that I can scan it, I can move it with the warehouse management, organize it in locations. That's essentially what we're trying to do there. So when you're looking for customers, make sure you research the supply chain. So look at the inventory flow of products from suppliers to customers. How is it moving? Obviously, the warehouse management, we have functionality for receiving product and shipping product. So that's the key pieces. But in between, we need to look at how many warehouses, where's the distribution centers, what type of work they're doing within those. Are we moving bulk shipments? Are we picking a lot of individual parts? All of those different flows are going to affect the setup that you need in the warehouse management. The size of the organization. You could have a really large organization, but a really small warehouse function. So what are the number of people that are involved in the warehouse process in each stage of the operation? These will determine what you might need to sort of consider. For example, when we get to picking functions or put away movements, if we have a small number of people, good chance they're pretty much autonomous in the warehouse. They know what to go and do in terms of work. So maybe user-directed functions when we set up user-directed picking and putting are probably fine for them because they'll just go and do the work that they need to do, as opposed to system-directed where the system's just going to tell them. That might be overkill for a small sort of warehouse. So we need to apply the functionality to the size of the organization. So what's the nature of the product? So, turnover of the product, physical size. We have customers in many different industries whether they're building an engineered product and using warehouse management to ship a large engineered product, to a typical parcel shipping type implementation. So you need to look at the size of the product and how it's moved, how it's stored, because that'll determine obviously the rules and how you're configuring the warehouse. So types of products like discrete products, engineered products, bulk products. We have process manufacturing customers that are using warehouse management. So I've got a vat. I'm going to take some product out of a vat into a picking bin. We'll move it over to a blending location, for example. All of those things are possible. They're all just movements of product through the warehouse, for example. We do have an ownership concept that's in there, which is consignment, largely on the supply side. So as I'm moving inventory into the warehouse, who's owning it? So it could still be owned by the vendor up until the time we consume that. So there is a consignment piece in there, for example. So we want to also look at the speed. How fast is product moving through the cycle? Do we have conveyor belt systems? Like, do we have any sort of materials, equipment handling that are moving product in the warehouse? Because that'll determine the functional needs that you're going to need to apply to the configuration. The types of shipping, are we just doing parcel shipping? Therefore, do we need carrier interfaces? So you might need to go and get some add-on solutions, for example. So we need to look at that sort of functional flow. Are we doing like full truckload, less than truckload? How is that shipping sort of organized? Because that'll determine how we sort of manage the loads, shipments, and how do we sort of configure that work or shipments to get out. Are we doing things like our own deliveries? Do we have our own trucks? How are we managing those? Whether we manage them or not, it's still a load, still a shipment. We're going to put it onto a truck. It's just the organization of that, and then how do we interface to organizing that truck to actually be there, for example. Paper versus devices. So we'll have a look in the process. We do have a warehouse mobile device app. So it's the application that'll run on an Android or a Windows-based device. Now, what you need to look in some organizations is, do you really need a mobile device? We have some very large customers that ship large products to use the warehouse management. But because the products are large, the people know where to go in the warehouse. As long as they've got a piece of paper, that's fine for them. They don't necessarily need to go and scan it because it's a large product. They know where to go and pick it from and stuff like that. So there's certainly situations where you need to sort of say, is a mobile device overkill for the patterns and scenarios that the customer's trying to apply? So you need to look at those. Also, in the context of, are you coming from a scenario where everything is paper-based today? So we print a paper picking list, and therefore the users are happy with paper because they check their check marks on as they check it through. Is that good enough for them? Obviously, that's a training exercise to train them onto a new mobile device. That adds some control capabilities, and that's maybe what's needed to move from paper to a device-based implementation, for example. But obviously, you need to look at those in terms of what effects that's going to have on the workers, what can they do, how can they move their materials, and don't get them stuck, for example. We need to look at, are we doing any sort of value-added services through the warehouse? So, for example, do we do any sort of kitting or some sort of line assembly process in terms of we sell a bunch of lines on the sales order, so we sell those lines, and then in the warehouse when we pick them, someone does some sort of kitting for them, for example. So in the warehouse we don't really have a kitting process. We could work around it, but that's where you need to look at those processes and what is it that you really need to implement in the warehouse. All right. So other things are equipment and automation. We have some new features, and I'll touch on them in a bit, that's coming in terms of do we have pick walls, for example, or do we do a pick to light sort of scenario, those sort of things, because that may mean that you need to maybe build an interface to some of that equipment. We have customers that use material handling equipment like Cardex, for example, so very small parts. The pick list gets sent to the Cardex system. The picker just hits the button and the Cardex system will roll around. We don't have that integration out of the box, but so if you need that, you may need to look at like how does those processes get enabled, for example. So organization, intercompany. The warehouse management in F&O is within the legal entity. So you need to look at that organization in terms of if I've got two legal entities and I'm storing products in each of those legal entities, and therefore I need to warehouse them, is it the same people that operate the same functions? Because essentially they'll need to do the ability to change a company, for example. And so you need to look at that segregation of how the data is organized in the application as well. So all of these things will affect the setup and the process. So some things to sort of consider. Regulation, for example, we have some customers that ship hazardous materials. Out of the box at the moment, we don't have codes and classifications that really are needed to print on shipping documentation for hazardous materials. Certainly customers have got interfaces to third-party solutions, for example, like Process Weaver and things like that. We are working on some features that should help in that sort of area, but you need to look at those sort of the nature of the product and what sort of shipping documents do you need to print out, for example, because this will affect the configuration of the warehouse and what extra work you might need to do in terms of the implementation. So quality. I'll touch on quality. There is some integration to the quality module in warehouse management, so I can create a quality order when I receive some product, and therefore I might work on the quality order to check the product. There's some features that we've got coming to enhance some of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So retail. Often we have a lot of customers using warehouse management with the retail sort of capabilities that we have. So we need to look at the processes in terms of what happens in, for example, a DC and what happens in a store. Essentially, a retail store has got a warehouse behind it. So when we configure a retail store, there's a warehouse connected to it. But are those people that are going to do the inventory receiving at the store, are they going to be full warehouse type people, or are they going to be people that operate just the point of sale? And so therefore, what interface do we need to give them? So those are some of the capabilities you need to look at that workflow from a DC. How do we organize transfer orders? Because that replenishment capability we have, and how do we move those orders? How do people work in the back-end store? Can they use the mobile device in the store, or do they need it, for example? So I've touched on some of the different pieces of distribution type customers. We do have a transport module in the application, and the transport module is got some functionality like freight invoice reconciliation. I can manage my carriers, carrier rates, and things like that. We don't have a yard management feature, so these are some things that if you need, you might need to do customizations or look for in terms of, we do have a basic docking and appointment sort of functionality. So those are the things you need to make sure that we look at the overall sort of process flow of what is it that you need to implement, for example. Alrighty. So let's review sort of some of the core sort of capabilities that we're doing. So when we're receiving products, obviously we're integrated to purchase management, so we can create a purchase order, we can receipt it through the mobile device and put the product away. And we'll have a look at that in the process, more in the context of what needs to be configured in the back-end application to configure some of these processes, because there is a lot of tools that you have, a lot of tools and rules to go and configure processes. So I'll skip over some of these features at high level so we can get into some of the back-end configuration and see what it looks like. Obviously, we can ship product. So we do have features like containerization and packing stations. So if I need to pack into a box, put a label on it, those sort of things, then we have a packing station to do that. And obviously, core warehouse functions like cycle counting, those sort of capabilities are in the product to handle the day-to-day sort of processes. So the mobile device function, this is what we're going to see when we work. One of the nice things is we can configure the menu items through the menuing system. This is the key interface to most of the workers in the warehouse. They're going to interface with the mobile device here. And so one of the nice things is the managers can configure those menu items, and those menu items really determine how work is done within the warehouse. So that's the key piece. And this is what we need to look at in terms of when we're setting up the warehouse, is what functions do workers need? Do workers only need to do receiving? Do they only need to do put away activity? Do they only need to do picking? Because then you'll configure the menus to determine what type of functions you're going to give to a specific worker, for example. So you have that flexibility in the app. Now the application is essentially just a shell application that you'll get from the Play Store or the Windows Store, and then the menu configuration is in the back-end application. So if you change the menus, you don't need to redeploy the device that's on the actual, the app that's actually on the device. So that's one of the advantages for the configuration piece that's in there. So if anyone's been using the mobile device with AX2012, we still have a lot of customers that are running AX2012 R3 and the warehouse management when it was introduced in there. There is a difference between the architecture in terms of how the app works to the web interface that was in AX2012. So I just wanted to refresh on that if there is any customers that are going to upgrade, because you'll need to look at moving to the mobile device. Because that'll be an investment. Today in AX2012, for example, it's essentially a web browser, and as long as the device supports a web browser, then you can run an interface to the warehouse workers will use that device. When we change, or if you move to D365, then the app is the only option for the warehouse worker, so you will need to look at that inventory of devices, make sure they're Android devices or Windows devices that can run the app. So that's something to consider in the deployment, making sure you can use those capabilities. So maybe one point, there's a couple of example devices mentioned here. We don't essentially publish a supported device list, which is a mega list of all devices that we supported. So that's something you consider. There's a few different devices that are tested there. They're not necessarily the latest and greatest. But when you are looking at devices, you essentially want to work with the manufacturer. A lot of the manufacturers do site audits, those sort of things where they can come and look at the wireless infrastructure, the RF capabilities, if you're upgrading devices. So I definitely work with a manufacturer if you need to do a lot of device changes, for example. So that's something to consider in the move. All right, so obviously the warehouse structure, I'll skip over some of these. We have all of the typical sort of capabilities that you're going to find to organize locations in the warehouse. The structure is up to you to define. We have, of course, the ability for unlimited warehouses. Each warehouse can have an entirely different configuration. Each zone, each set of locations within a zone could have another set of configuration. That's entirely up to you. We've certainly got customers that have cold storage and obviously perishable goods and obviously different rules for moving those goods. So the system can handle all of those capabilities in terms of different types of location profiles, putting goods away relevant to types of locations if you need to move them around, things like that. So that's all sort of self-definable in the application. We can set up some things like stocking limits, so volumetrics. Some of the processes have the ability to use volumetrics. And those in implementations, we need to sort of consider the actual worker. Obviously, if we do use defined rules and we have volumes of where work and goods would be put away, we certainly have situations where there's always exceptions, right? Someone's put goods in the wrong spot. How does the worker know to go to a different location? Do we have overflow locations, things like that? So those are things to sort of consider in terms of setting up the warehouse configuration. We do have a concept called license plating, which may or may not be familiar to some. It is an important capability in terms of grouping inventory. It could represent a physical pallet, for example, or it could represent a logical grouping of products and how you might move them in the warehouse. Those are good capabilities if we're doing a lot of transfer orders, because I can use the license plates to move a bulk collection of things from one location to another, for example, and avoid doing individual movement of goods. So you need to consider when and where you need to use license plating, whether it's relevant. If you don't, obviously there's a conversion. If you're coming from a legacy system, how do you start to implement license plating? As well, when we talk about numbering, whether it's license plate numbers, location numbers, how are we going to physically label something? If we're going to implement a new process and we're going to ask the warehouse worker to go and scan a location, are those locations actually barcoded already in the warehouse? How does that physical environment match to what's in the system, for example? So we need to sort of consider those physical assets when we're going to do the configuration in the back end. So obviously we can print labels, so the location labels and all that configuration when we're setting up the warehouse. So some things to consider. As well, when we're doing license plating, when does the license plate actually get labeled? Sometimes we have physical totes that could be a license plate that we're going to pick product into. So I'm going to move that tote as a picking tote through the warehouse. They might be permanently labeled, so I can use the label on them, for example. But other cases, we might need to actually print a license plate label in the process of receiving materials. So do you pre-print them, for example, and then a worker just has a pre-printed roll? All of those sort of strategies you want to look at for the flow of the material if you want that worker to actually scan something. Because if there's nothing printed for them to scan, they can't use a scanner, obviously. So we need to look at that flow. So the work in the warehouse is essentially what it is that we're working on. So everything in warehouse management is work, and all of the rules and configuration is really around work. So configuring what picking work is, what put away work is, cycle counting work, all of these are activities in the warehouse, and they're all sort of considered work, and that's what the rules are there for, to configure and use, for example. So we obviously have the ability to do refilling or replenishment. These are some areas that you really need to plan the process flow. If we're picking and we have a replenishment process, is the replenishment process actually done before the picking? So we've had a lot of customers, maybe new to the configuration of the warehouse management, get those sequencing a little out, and so we end up with a lot of workers going to locations that are not refilled yet, for example, and therefore we're wasting time. There's also performance considerations in terms of running replenishment and refilling activities that you'll need to consider. When we wave product, we can also run replenishment, but is that the right strategy to replenish at exactly the time that we're going to wave our shipments, for example? So that configuration of processes, you need to make sure you test, configure, and do performance testing on it with the volumes of inventory that you're going to work in the warehouse, because you can certainly create configuration that could cause performance issues. And then considering we're talking about warehouse where we've got trucks waiting and potentially going to have a penalty if that truck doesn't move, we need to make sure we do the configuration and test it. Otherwise, we could end up with issues where workers can't get their work done, for example. So the work, when we're talking about shipments or production work for movement of the goods, are generated by waves. Now, how you organize waves, again, is up to you. And that'll depend on the nature of the products, whether there's a morning shipment or an afternoon shipment, whether you have cutoff times, whether you're trying to pick by a customer, by an individual order. The wave is the tool based on the parameters to determine how the work will get generated and allocated out in the warehouse. So obviously you need to consider the size of waves because again that could cause performance issues. If we're going to run one wave and we've got trucks waiting there for the system to actually generate those waves, generate the work, and therefore waiting for the pickers to actually pick, if we can't get the wave run in time, we've probably got trucks sitting there idle, for example. So we need to look at the strategies of the filters. How are the waves actually configured? What is it that you're actually trying to get out in that run? So there's lots of different strategies. We don't necessarily need to have one wave, for example. You could have waves based on types of products. You could have waves based on exception codes, because you have the ability to filter a wave. And so if order entry operators put an exception or an expedite code on the sales order, you can use those to filter and pull out the products that you're trying to pick, for example. All right, so we do have the ability to pack into containers. So again, this is a strategy in terms of what do you do for that product to move out the door? Is it already in shipping boxes, or do I need to pack it into other boxes that we're going to use for shipping, for example? This is where we need to also consider the label printing part of it. What labels do we need to print? So we have some new features coming on some label functionality. We certainly have some customers that have built interfaces to labeling systems. So when the wave runs, they'll print their labels for the cartons. The operators can pick those off as they fill a carton, for example. So many different strategies in terms of how you might pack and how labels might be printed. But those are some things that you'll need to consider in the configuration, which is how do you print labels on the products that are going out, for example. Alrighty, so let's have a look at some processes and some back-end configuration here. So I'm looking at obviously the core finance and operations here, and then we have our mobile device. Obviously I'm just running it on an emulator, and to save some time here, I'm going to be typing in the numbers to save scanning, for example. And so what we talked about is the ability to do configuration. So I'm going to find all my warehouse functionality in warehouse management and transportation management. So some of the main things that we sort of talked about when we just went through there is we have work. And so given we have only got an hour, I'm going to point out some of these configurations and some of the where you're going to go and do some of these. I won't go and do the whole configuration, because we could spend quite a few hours actually going and doing all this configuration. But the main elements that you want to look at to actually configure work flowing through the warehouse is what we want to point out. So we talked about the mobile devices menus. So this is where I'm going to configure my menus under the mobile devices here. And so, for example, I've got my inbound menus. And so each menu, we're organized by menu items. So when we're creating menu items, the mode here is the type of work that we're going to do with that menu. So if we look at indirect functions, these are functions that are not generally related to work. So you'll find things like item inquiry. If I just want to have a lookup of an item, how much inventory is in the system, for example, then I could say that my item inquiry is that function, and then create the menu. Now, it won't display on the device until you reconfigure the menu. And so if we go over to our menus, then this is where I can look at, for example, my inventory, and here's my menu item, and a very, very constructive name called A here, but at least it'll stand out, right? So let me get my mouse working. All right, so I'm going to put this menu over here, and we should have inventory on our main menu. So now that I've saved the changes, then on my devices, if we look here, then we've got a new menu item on the device, which is called A. And so that's where we're going to go and do configuration to determine what the user can do. And so what we also have here is the layout of the capture. In this case, you'll see the little window and the layout. So these are configurations that we'll find in the mobile setup in terms of the app field names and app priorities. These will determine the type of input. So you can play with all of the different types of field names in the mobile device configuration by changing these input types. That'll determine that type of display and the configuration that you're going to get there. So if I type in my item here, then this will be where I'll see inventory for this product. So the menuing capability is quite powerful to allow you to do that configuration. Now, the main menus that you're going to work with is menus that are configured around work. So in the work menu, this is where we're going to configure a connection to things like work classes, and the work classes have a connection to our work templates. At the end of the day, they're filtering capabilities. When the user clicks the menu, what's that connection to the device that they're going to see? So this is where we're going to configure the actual interaction with the mobile device and how the user works with it. So we'll see options here. For example, am I allowed to split work? So for example, does a worker gets to a location, or they've got a quantity of work, but they know they can't handle a quantity of work, and they split the work and do it in two pieces, for example. So you want to determine the rules of what you're allowing the operator to actually process when they work through the warehouse. All right, so there's many different functions that we might want to sort of configure through there. Now, we want to configure things called work templates. And the connection here is, we'll see over there, the work class at the bottom end of the line. So the work templates are based on the document in the system. And so we have many different documents, obviously, in terms of what type of work we might be trying to manage. So if it's a sales order, purchase order, raw materials picking, transfer line, transfer receipt, all of those type of documents throughout the system will have a work template, and therefore each of those type of documents we can configure the rules for. So the rules generally, how is work generated, which are our pick and put lines, for example. And so therefore all of our rules in terms of how the system will generate that work is controlled by our work template. Now, this is where we need to be careful in the configuration because we'll see that we have the ability to do queries, for example. So it's a concept across the warehouse management is that I have the ability to do queries, and then queries allow me to match up this template to this warehouse, for example, or this template to whatever. And so therefore you can use the queries to define different types of rules. Now the thing with the queries is it gives you a lot of flexibility, but you do need to test it so that we don't create rules that we're going to get a worker stuck in the warehouse, for example, or the template runs and it doesn't actually generate any work because it doesn't actually find data in fields. So this is where we need to be quite careful in the configuration of the warehouse management. It gives you a lot of flexibility, but you can also get yourself stuck in some of that configuration. So essentially what we're defining here is that work, and therefore when we set up those mobile device menus, we have the connection to the work class, and then therefore I can use those to filter out that menu button that the user will see and what work they can actually do in the warehouse. All right. So when we go and do work, we need to find locations. So in the configuration of the warehouse, we'll have the ability to create our locations. Locations have our location formats, stocking limits, things like that. There is a wizard to create it. So all of the information about the formats, whether it's an aisle, rack, shelf, bin, whatever sort of combination of numbering, that sort of thing, that's obviously self-configurable. Now, once we've actually created all those locations, we can actually obviously see them in the warehouse. But how does the system know how to go and find those? So the key thing here is that we have another setup which we call location directives. And so the location directives is really the key for the system to go and search for locations. So again, I'll use the word search because that's essentially what the rules are doing here is when the work generation happens from our work template, I'll need to go and look for locations, and therefore the location directives will come into play there. So this is again where we need to be careful in terms of our configuration. So we'll see in this case, I'm doing sales orders. So obviously there's a different work type for each document. So again, if you're not in production, you're not doing lean, you probably don't need to configure the Kanban templates, for example. So just configure what you need to configure. But the key is that given that these are possibly connected to a site in a warehouse, for example, you could have many different rules. So you need to consider the setup of the amount of warehouses that you have. We have a lot of customers that use warehouses for example, inventory allocation. So I might move some goods over to a warehouse to keep them out of my main warehouse so that the sales order entry people don't see them, for example. Now, if you warehouse enable an item, if you're just going to do that movement from a transfer, you'll need to sort of consider some of the standard inventory adjustment journals, some of those sort of things if you don't want to use the mobile device functionality to move inventory between warehouses. But the other point there is that obviously these rules are each by warehouse, which allows you to have many different warehouses, many different ways that work can move through different warehouses. So it gives you that flexibility to find many different rules in the system. So again, we need to consider, as we talked about in the beginning, the volume of inventory. We have things like you'll see on the lines here, the quantity breaks. Do I need to create work or allocate work based on quantity to different workers, things like that? So I can have quantity and work allocation breaks from here. And therefore find different, if it's bulk goods, I might find locations that are bulk locations. So therefore, we have a connection between the quantity and how we're going to go and find locations. So this is a key setup again. And again, we need to be careful because each of these rules, for example, the locations query here, we can search for locations based on things like the profile, codes, what have you, for example. But if we don't get our query right, we could end up with the system not finding a location, so therefore work will be created and it'll have an empty location in the work line. And so this is what we need to be careful in terms of testing all of these. And when we set up work and set up work templates and locations, consider having fallback templates, for example. So maybe you have the restrictive queries for types of work, and then you have a catch-all so that you can catch, so that at least something's created, for example. Otherwise, you'll be looking through some of the logs. So when work is created, you'll find, for example, the inquiries, things like mobile device log. You'll find the performance analysis, picking link reports, monitoring reports. So all of these sort of reports will give you different sort of logs in terms of what's happening, for example. So if the location directives run but didn't find anything, you can look through some of those location logs, for example. But you don't want to be doing that in the course of business during the day, because if we're doing that, then work's being created incorrectly, and that's going to slow down the warehouse. So we really need to make sure we test all of these rules when we configure them and set them up. Alrighty. So at the end of the day, these configurations will generate work for us in here. And what we'll see in here is work being generated. Now the work will be generated from the wave, and so or from the wave or from menu functions, for example, in a receiving. And so this is where we need to look at what is actually being configured. And so if we have our rules configured, then the work will be generated and we have the ability to execute some of those things. So let's go and do a few of these things. Now what I've done is put in a couple of documents so that will shortcut the process here. So I save a bit of keying here. So let's go and have a look at a basic process. And I think I broke my menus, so let's go back. So good example of being careful, because I deleted my menu there, for example. Alrighty, so good example of just being careful around doing some of this configuration. So if I've saved my changes, all right, I messed them up, but that'll do for the moment. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to use the purchase receive function. Now, this is where you need to consider the types of work. And how is this configured? Do you do it in 2 stages? Do you do it in 1 stage? Because each of the menu items will determine the type of work. So you'll see, for example, I can do purchase put away, and I can do a purchase receive. But we do have the function to actually do a receive and a put away in 1 step. So you need to consider that flow of work in terms of what menu and what functions you need to provide. And so this is essentially that configuration that you need to test out and work through, for example. So I'm going to receive my purchase order here. Now, you'll see this was my item I'd set up. You'll see if we did that control configuration, I have the plus and minus button here. Again, that was in those field name configurations, and that gives me the ability to, for example, scan. If I want to scan and count the boxes, as opposed to just typing in a number or scanning one and typing in a number, then I can do that as quality validation. So in my case, I'm just receiving 5 of these products. And so we need to consider things like the detail, unit conversions. I've set this one up pretty simply in terms of it's just using eaches, for example. And so that's the function that the worker is going to work. So it's pretty simplistic on the device. The idea is to obviously get them through a function and then get them to their next activity. Excuse me. Now, you'll see what that menu would have done is if I go into work, then I've created put away work. So those rules are run in play here. Now, this is where you need to consider work processes. For example, what if a user makes a mistake? How do I cancel work? How do I complete work? Things like that. In what errors happen between the device and the backend function. So you'll see a lot of those configurations, for example, on the worker. I configure whether they can change put locations, pick locations, those sort of things. So you need to look at those overrides. So essentially the worker can now process work. If I've probably messed up main menu here, I can't get back there. But anyway, you have the ability to do you have the ability to do work lists. So in this case, I could go to a function and see what work needs to be done, and therefore I can execute it. But if I wanted to use system-directed functions, then those can drive the process, or I can have work lists to actually show me the work. So in this case, I know this is the work I'm going to do. And so we'll see the information that's configured here. A lot of the menu devices will give you, the menu parameters on the device will give you the ability to control what information gets displayed here, so users can see additional confirmation. Again, those are on the confirmation settings in the menu items. So I can execute my pick, I'm going to my location, and then I'm doing my put. So I put that inventory away in the warehouse. So that's essentially a basic sort of process, but all of the elements of the configuration actually put together in the system. So what else do we need to look at? So we have integrated transportation management. We can use the loads function to load planning. And so we have the freight reconciliation. So we do have the ability to do rating and appointment scheduling. Again, this is for the docks that you have, the inbound, outbound docks on your warehouse. So you can do a basic driver check-in, check-out function, for example. The freight invoice capability is fairly handy. We do have some customers that didn't really need full warehouse management, but if I want to use transportation management, I need to use the full warehouse management function. But you can set up warehouse minimally enough with a warehouse with basic locations to still get inventory through in a minimal sort of way, but allow you to use transportation management. So they've set it up just to be able to get to use freight invoice, for example. So there's different freight engines that we can use to do rating, freight reconciliation, for example. Once we import the bills, how does it find and match the loads that we need to do? There is a Power BI capability. It gives you the ability to, I don't want to do updates right now. It gives you the ability to look at some of those metrics of inventory moving through the warehouse. So you can use those data entities and obviously customize those a lot further to look at some of those metrics that you might want to measure in your warehouse, for example. So you do have that capability. And I realized I was showing that on the screen, but I didn't switch monitors. But in any case, I'll leave it at that. So, so you do have those Power BIs. So maybe some things to sort of consider when we start to consider implementing warehouse management. The first thing is plan. As I've sort of mentioned a few times, like plan and test and plan and test. We have a lot of customers that have done basic configuration, gone live, and then the trucks start backing up at the warehouse door on the day they go live because they can't get product out. It's not a situation that we really want to be in. So the key is that really we want to make sure we test and make sure we configure all those rules and look for some of the performance issues that could happen if we do over-configure the system, for example. So consider phases. Am I implementing different warehouses incrementally, things like that. So I'll skip through this fairly quickly, and then we'll get on to maybe some of the new stuff that's coming. So make sure we do a proper gap fit. What features do we need? Obviously, we have the ability to do customization. I can obviously build new types of menu items. I can't change the warehouse mobile device app, but you can do customization to build new types of menu items and stuff like that. Data migration is quite important. We've had customers that move from non-license plate into license plate tracking when they implement the warehouse. So obviously we need to consider that reconciliation of what's in the physical world to what's in the system, because in the data migration, if we don't get that data migration right, the rules are going to start running and we're going to start sending pickers to locations where there's no inventory. And so we've certainly had customers that have done that as well in the process of implementing, and so therefore we waste a lot of workers' time skipping work, moving to different locations. So we really need to consider that data migration and test that data migration when you move over. I'll skip over these a little bit quicker, but they'll be there in the slides. So, make sure we educate. Don't try to implement just legacy processes into the new warehouse. It is a different set of terminology and configuration in terms of how we do configure. So you might want to just make sure we educate first how it works and then see what the gaps are, for example. So I'll skip over some of these things just in the spirit of time. So fit gap, devices we talked about before, customizations. So some customizations we often sort of see is label integration. So many different and creative ways to do labels. We don't have a label designer, so you will need a label designer. We can take the ZPL output from the label designer and use it in the warehouse, but you will need some sort of label designer. Unless you're using pre-printed labels, those sort of things. EDI, we do have the ability to use ASNs, for example. So we have that data model in our data model, but if you have got an EDI package, you'll need to obviously build that interface to take that ASN message into our warehouse and map it to our format, for example, so there's probably work there. Shipping carrier integration. So we don't have an out-of-the-box integration to like a FedEx, UPS to get the label back. Those customizations and solutions are available. So that's just not out of the box, for example. So if you want to print those labels. So integration to materials equipment handling, and I'll talk about some of these things in a sec in terms of what we've got. Integration to other shipping software. We do have a lot of customers that use our warehouse management, but they've been using other software like Process Weaver, things like that, to actually print all of the shipping documentation. So they just send pick lists or manifest to those applications, and then they've already got their pre-printed documentation. So not saying we don't have all the documentations, but it's just that they'd been using some of those software before. So those are common patterns of where we're seeing customers implement different types of configuration. Data migration we talked about. Documentation, it's not too early to start training. Get key people from the warehouse and train them early. It's really key to that conversion process. Testing. It seems kind of silly, don't go live without testing, but we certainly had customers gone live without testing. Doesn't end up very well for all of us, but keep it in mind from the very beginning. Test. All right. Performance planning. I'm going to skip over this a little bit because we do have another session that's a little bit more code-oriented to talk about performance, but the slides are there. So where are we from a roadmap perspective? So we have a lot of customers and very diverse customers, doing parcel shipping, many different types of products in terms of apparel, packaged goods. So we're adding functionality to help across all different sort of industries. And a lot of this is driven from customer feedback, where we're seeing customers struggle in the implementations, where they've requested new features. And so what we've done is the original code base for the warehouse management came from the Blue Horse solution. And so this was announced last year that we did acquire the advanced warehouse solution functionality, and we're putting that on top of the product. The key is we've started to release some of this functionality, so I'll go through and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what's sort of coming and when. So some of the basic capabilities that are coming in terms of blind returns, so that we might not have a return order created. I need to better manage some of that goods coming back into the warehouse. Some better integration to quality control. I have a basic item sampling capability to integrate to quality, for example. On outbounds, we have some new wave label printing steps, so I can do some additional printing of labels when the wave runs. We will often see that with customers where they'll have all of the work sent to the warehouse. They'll send the print run for the labels at the same time, so therefore the workers can just pull off those labels, for example. So we have some new functionality around pallet building. How do we assemble pallets? So a lot of the functionality is really around handling exceptions better. In terms of warehouse workers going to locations, splitting work, splitting shipments, those sort of things, that's where we'll find a lot of additional functionality. So we'll see, for example, as I mentioned before, we have some enhanced small parcel carrier functionality, but we haven't got the actual service call piece, so that would still be an add-on piece when we release this functionality. So maybe just as a little bit of an overview of if anyone's starting to get some of the 10.0 builds and what's there, some of these features that are actually creeping in the application, and you'll find them and if I switch over here, hopefully, I've got a preview build here. And if it logs on for me. It's always the good with presenting, that'll always time out. There we go. All right, so if you do have some of the preview or in some of the preview programs and you're getting some of those builds, you can actually start to play with a few of these features as they're coming in. So you'll see, for example, if I go into warehouse management, we talked about work templates before. So you'll see some new type of documents down the bottom here for like sorted inventory picking. So I can there's some new sorting sequences and stuff that I can use with menu items. You'll see a new cross-docking document here. So we're adding some new functionality for opportunistic cross-docking. I can also do that from production, for example. So as the stuff comes off production, and then I can cross-dock it to a shipment. So you'll see some of this coming in. So as well, if we, as we had a look before, our mobile device menus, if we are using some functionality like our system-directed, you'll see some new functionality like system-directed sorting. So this gives us the ability to, when work is allocated on the mobile device in system, because the operator is really just getting things in a queue, I've got some better sorting sequences. So I can sort the work maybe by different attributes in the warehouse, because essentially it gives us the ability to pick what sort of field in the work that I might need to sort. So therefore, as we give them work, we can better direct them around the warehouse. So some better work sort of patterns through the warehouse. So you'll see some of these features creep into the application. So the system-directed work sequence that you'll find, some load work detail functions. So when work is created in the warehouse, sometimes a manager might want to go and change the location on that work. So the work details allow you to do some overrides, change and manage the work functions from the back end a little bit nicer. The wave printing function, a load building feature coming is in 0.1. So some extra picking grouping line features, so I can group lines together for patterns in terms of how I might want to group work in the warehouse. Some additional features, for example, around cluster picking. If I do cluster picking, we have maybe an issue for some workers where if I'm picking into a tote, for example, and that tote gets full, technically I've still got this other work to do, but for some reason it doesn't fit into this box. So we can override and say that I'm full, and then the work will be left there to be completed, for example. So again, a lot of these are around some of the exceptions that we've seen customers run into when they're setting up, and how do we override some of those things. So the sorting feature, example, replenishment over location capacity. This again where we've seen customers where they have a fixed location for goods, because we can set up fixed locations for item and put them in that. But there's often seasonality where we might have preparation for our season coming up, and so therefore we have a bulk order come in and we haven't changed our fixed location. So we still want to put the goods in the warehouse, but if I send them to my normal fixed location, it's going to be full. So we have the ability to overfill it, for example, some rules like that. So again, trying to help the workers deal with some of these exceptions and how do they work. So other things to sort of mention is that we do have fixes coming in. Again, given that we're running in the cloud and we've got a lot of interaction with customers, we are trying to keep up with the issues customers come into and the hot fixes. So if you are working with warehouse, make sure you keep current and take some of these hot fixes that are there. So I've just listed out a few. So issues in terms of completing work, things like that. So I won't list these all out, but they are in the slides that you can have a look at. So what I've done is listed out all of the different pieces of functionality that are coming in. We don't have the time to read through these because I won't sit here and make you read all of the words here. But they're in the slides for the presentation, so you can see some of the features that I didn't mention in those specific version numbers. Some of these features that are coming in later releases that might be helpful for you in terms of allocation strategies, the cross-docking that I mentioned before, load building, some additional transportation planning capabilities, labels we talked about, line receivings. There's a new carrier assignment wave so that when we do waiving, I can do a carrier assignment if we've allocated a carrier on customers' orders, for example. Improvements around catch weight functionality. The cluster full that I mentioned. So again, I won't read all these, but they're in the slides so that you can have a look at some of these things that are coming new, for example. So one of the ones that I wanted to call out is, as I mentioned before when I talked about customization, there is some capabilities to do integrations to materials handling equipment, to some of these scenarios where we have pick walls type situations. So those capabilities are coming in. So you might want to look at those if you have conveyor belt systems or things like that. So there is a lot of new stuff coming, but those current ones are listed on the slides. So you'll see that we're continuing to do a lot of work to improve the warehouse. It's a big investment area for us in terms of what we're trying to improve. So if you're looking to sort of keep up to date, there is a supply chain team blog that you can find information. I have a blog there. I'd like to do more often, but you'll find a lot of basic sort of videos there, how to set up warehouse and stuff like that. If you want to join the community feedback, if you're interested in warehouse management, then you can get on Yammer Group there. And so the release roadmaps that you're going to find there, so that's where a lot of these are listed. So with that, thanks very much for coming in. Hopefully it gives you a little bit of information further around what's there, some configuration in the warehouse. It'll give you a little bit of guide in terms of starting out and configuring some of the capabilities in the warehouse and a little bit of the roadmap that we're working on. So enjoy the rest of the conference.